Good afternoon. I'm Steve Call. I'm the president of the New America Foundation. It's my pleasure to welcome you to this presentation by Eric Schmidt, the chairman and CEO of Google. The New America Foundation is a 10-year-old nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy institute that invests in new thinkers, writers, researchers, and scholars whose work promises to bring forward new ideas and analysis to address the next generation of policy challenges facing the United States. We've got about 100 people working with us in Washington and California. And when I joined New America as its second president about a year ago, I was attracted by the exceptional quality of our board of directors. It includes writers like Fareed Zakaria and Jim Fallows and Dan Yergin and Anne-Marie Slaughter, and economic leaders such as Roger Ferguson and Bernard Schwartz and Laura Tyson. But another measure of our good fortune is that Eric Schmidt has been an active member of New America's board of directors since our think tank's founding 10 years ago. At that time, Eric had not yet joined Google, but was leading Novell. And what animated him then, and I think what you'll hear animates him now, was an interest in forward-looking and non-ideological thinking about public life and public policy, and particularly about those persistent challenges which have so often proved impervious to conventional party politics, the challenges facing our healthcare and education systems, the challenges of climate change, energy policy, and foreign policy, and the need for an investment-led approach to economic growth, and of course the changing role of technology in public life. Today, of course, we encounter Eric as the chairman and chief executive of one of the world's most innovative and influential technology companies, Google. In his role at New America, however, our conversation has not changed since the time that he was involved with our founding. We're still animated by the same values, and we're still recruiting new thinkers and new writers who can reshape public understanding of the most important issues in national life. And I consider Eric to be one of New America's important thinkers, with the added bonus from my point of view that he no longer requires a stipend. A year ago, at my request, Eric agreed to become chairman of New America, on whose board he had so long served, and in that role I found him to be an outstanding partner, engaged but never intrusive, dedicated to transparency, a defender of intellectual independence and academic freedom at our institute, and above all, one of the sharpest analysts of complex patterns that I've ever had the pleasure to listen to, and I think you'll discover that about him today. There's a certain rigor, frankness, and architecture of thought that the very best scientists bring to discussions of public policy matters, and Eric's thinking, in my experience, very much reflects those qualities. What you may not know about him is he's also a local guy. He is a product of a local public high school. I believe his mother is here today. I don't want to embarrass her, but I hope you'll all be suitably respectful when we turn to questions. He graduated from Yorktown High School in Arlington. He then studied electrical engineering at Princeton, and after that earned a doctorate in computer science at Berkeley. These days, in addition to his day job at Google, he is a member of President-elect Obama's Economic Advisory Transition Team, but I want to emphasize that he is not speaking today in any reference to that role, but rather as a chairman of New America and as, of course, the CEO of Google. Our program today has a very simple format. Eric's going to talk for about half an hour and then take questions for a similar amount of time. There are microphones on the side. Please remember, as you address your questions, to keep them short, avoid speeches, and also you're on the record throughout today, so keep that in mind if you do ask a question. And with that, please join me now in welcoming Eric Schmidt to the microphone.
Thank you. Thank you, Steve, very much. I think you see with Steve's introduction why he has been such an effective and dynamic president of the New America Foundation. It's an organization that I think is one of the great things about America, a place where people gather, they have new ideas, and I disagree with a whole bunch of them, right? To me, that's the real test. You know, are they challenging? Are they provocative? Are they really making a big difference? Let me thank Steve for not just this event, but of course his tremendous leadership in the last year. And of course Rachel and the other folks who put this together and the whole New America staff. What I wanted to do is actually talk about the relationship of technology and policy, economic growth, and restoring trust in government. Seems to me that we're at one of those enormously important periods. I think it's a cliche to say that this is the sort of one of the great crises that we face, but this may be the toughest economic time that most of us will face in our lifetimes. And everybody here is familiar with the statistics. You know, the people unable to pay their mortgages, mortgages below water. You have the credit crisis and the fact that there's a liquidity issue, which is still not completely resolved. You have issues of significant potential large bankruptcies coming up online. And you have this bizarre period of a transition where we have a president and we have a next president, but we, as Senator Obama says, we only have one president at a time in our country. So from our perspective, we've got to make progress in the short term, and we've got to make progress in the long term. We've got to address at some point the healthcare issues, the schools issues. These are issues, by the way, that New America has some very interesting and innovative ideas about, but we have to do them in the context now. We've been delaying these things. We've had all of these problems, people locked in various partisan battles, and it's time to sort of get forward on that. And let me point out that, you know, our dependence on imported oil is this huge drain. And how many wars has oil created? How much of our cost, how much of our infrastructure has this been driving? It's time to address these issues. So I'm an optimist, and it's important to say that right up front because America is in a remarkable place, right? Unlike many other countries, right? We have the foundation, the intellectual foundation, the leadership, literally the people in the room, not just to solve these problems, but in fact to build an even better place. And so as a result, we have these interesting capabilities, right? I mean, let's go through this. 100 years ago, nobody had information. Now all of you are significant users of the internet. And in fact, in our lifetimes, all people, it's a reasonable statement, almost all people will have access to almost all the world's information. That is a remarkable achievement. I mean, just think about it. I mean, this is on par with the Gutenberg Bible and all that kind of stuff. And I'm not just talking about us, because you already have that information. I'm talking about the billion people who will start getting electronic access to information in the next 3 to 4 years over using their mobile phones. Think about what the arrival of accurate information will do to their lives, to their culture, to their opportunity, to their rhetoric, and I hope to their standard of living. Another thing that's going on is that essentially every American now can create and publish their ideas, and some of them are absolutely wacko. Okay? So with that as our given, you know, 2% are wacko, 98% are good. Okay? But the fact of the matter is that the power of communication in everyone's hands, my underlying thesis, people do not understand how powerful this is. I don't think our government understands it. I think they're getting it. I don't think we understand it. And I don't think we fully understand how liberating that is in terms of information, in terms of transparency, in terms of building new systems, in terms of making things happen. If you think about it, the barriers to innovation, small business, and so forth, the cost of starting a new company and so forth is so much lower. And you have science and technological advances that are unheard of. I'll talk a little bit in a bit about the energy crisis. The amount of money being poured into university research programs. The best and brightest are now going, 20-year-olds are going into these fields because they believe that they can change the world, make their professional mark, and be hugely successful in something that's critically relevant to our nation's future. It's a huge cause for optimism. And we have an opportunity, for example, to become the most energy efficient economy in the world with all sorts of really good benefits as a result of the innovation, the structure, the investment, and literally the drive of American will. It's interesting that technology makes a difference. And technology always follows these curves. Well, everybody says, oh my God. So the first sentence, the first telegraph message, what hath God wrought? Year 1844. This is not a new phenomenon. We're all ignorant of history. But these waves come over and over again when electricity happened. It's the same thing. Oh my God. Think about what we can now do. So we have that in us. We have that opportunity. And we have this balance now that we have to construct. I think we've had sort of the most extreme version of the free market rules approach, and we've seen some of its consequences. We have to balance, from a regulatory perspective, the enormous creativity of the free market with some of its unfettered excesses. And what we've been doing here in Washington is having these debates, right? As, you know, these simple caricatures of free markets, anything goes, versus socialists, right, who promote 5-year plans. Well, the right answer is the balance between these different groups, a balance that causes the outcomes that I'm talking about. And that balance is achievable by people with judgment, as long as they understand the objective, and the objective is to win. And I don't mean personally, I mean as a country, with the objectives that we set out and the things that we want to talk about. And what's happened now is that we're sort of finding this balance point. We're finding it again as we study what has happened in the last few years. And that fundamentally we have to agree with the free market, which is fundamental to the innovation and the capital formation and so forth. And what is the proper role of government? And I want to talk a little bit about that some more. But it's really important that the outcome here is that small startups with funny names, the next generation of Googles, get founded, get funded, and become successful in this new regime. Because that's where the wealth will be created. That's where those 20-year-olds will go. That's where the new set of innovation will be created. It's always true, and it will always be true. And the internet, of course, itself is an example of this. Everybody here knows, funded through DARPA. I was one of the recipients of some of the early grants, and it made a huge difference. The fact of the matter is that it was a network that was designed through protocols and standards without constraints on its ends. It's called the end-to-end principle. So what happens is, basically, as long as you're reasonably well behaved, you can connect anything you want. And look at all the things that people have connected, some successful, some not, some hugely successful. It is that openness, the ability that anyone can play, that is a characteristic of dynamic, scalable markets and networks that really drive the modern economy. So when these things grow, they grow very, very quickly. And they sort of become this phenomena that no one really understood its impact on, but we were optimistic. We understood that innovation would flourish in it. So why don't we do the same thing with the energy grid? Isn't it obvious? You have a command and control structure designed in the 1960s. Why don't you open it up, allow the innovation, things like distributed cogeneration and those sorts of things, all these interesting notions of smart grids, and a classic example being the ability to use the battery that's in your car to provide peak power, right? Literally, they pay you to provide peak power because it's cheaper to get the power from your battery than it is to build a coal-fired fuel plant, which is a disaster anyway, for peak power in the middle of the afternoon. You can charge the battery at night when energy is cheap. Seems obvious if you think about it. Why can't we do it? It's just a design problem. Every aspect that I just described has been shown in labs. It's part of the technology mission. People are excited about it, and it's easily achievable. It's just a matter of will. So that's what I really want to focus on today. So if you're going to spur economic growth, literally make it happen, you've got to focus on infrastructure, research, and development, of course, and energy. When we talk about 21st century infrastructure is like, is this like exciting or what? Well, it's really exciting to me. Okay, I'm sorry. Let's be very clear. You may like other things. Infrastructure is important because infrastructure is the foundation upon which wealth is created. And I mean societal capital. If you don't fundamentally build that infrastructure, you're not going to get the scale effects that I'm talking about. And I'm not just talking about roads and bridges, which are absolutely important and so forth, but I'm talking about new networks that can put tools of communication information in the hands of millions. Take a look at broadband. Here we are, we invented this stuff, and we're now 15th in the world. Only 55% of Americans have high-speed internet connection at their home, and in rural areas it's 1 in 3. So all of us do, but there's a whole bunch of Americans who don't. It's a big problem. We have almost no competition in many of these markets. Most people, 95%, only have 1 or 2 suppliers. There should be 4 or 5. You know, competition really does a great job of setting market prices. And so we have to move from a regulatory framework. You know, President Roosevelt took on the business of rural electrification in the 1950s. President Eisenhower talked about the interstate highway system and built an economic framework, one that will drive the development of this broadband infrastructure. And we have to find this right balance of incentives. Now, if you look, current Federal Communications has done tremendously good work on this against tremendous political and business pressure. They decided to open up the spectrum and increase consumer choices. And why did they do that? Because they read their charter. They said, this is our mission. Our mission is to make this infrastructure happen. It's an act of remarkable courage from the standpoint of the FCC, and one which we applaud. The decision to open up the white spaces. These spaces exist between television channels, roughly. And it provides a whole new unregulated spectrum that people can play with to develop new goods and services. An enormous increase in bandwidth that's available that you didn't even know you had. And now all of a sudden, by virtue of good regulation, good judgment, good insight, they can pull it off. And of course, we can do even more effective use of underutilized spectrum. Spectrum is everything in what we do, because we're mobile, right? And that spectrum is all around us. As we look here in the hall, it's all around us, and most of it's not being used at all for various reasons. Let's open it up. And then a universal broadband strategy that gets people more choices, more vendors, more platforms, and so forth. Literally build the market by making sure that people really can make this thing happen. My point is, these are not a panacea. They really, really do enable a whole new category of platforms. Open systems, right? Open systems meaning my ability to interconnect, my ability to run an application of any kind on any device, is at the cornerstone of this, because we don't know where the innovation is going to come from, but we're pretty sure it's not here. It'll be over there where we don't expect it. You never know where innovation comes from, but in an innovative model, you welcome it. You expect it. You build a platform that can accommodate it, and the rest happens. You know, and these open platforms really, really drive choices. I mean, it's the nature, in many ways, if we go back to the wisdom of crowds arguments, an open system means more voices. More voices mean more discussion. More choices mean better outcomes. A community makes a better decision than an individual. The sum of all of those are one spectrum of ideas. The alternative is the case of Ma Bell, right? You could have any telephone you want as long as it's big, heavy, and black, right? Sorry, that's not quite fair. Big and heavy and expensive. The opening up, which as you know was fought for 20 years, enabled this tremendous reduction in prices, lots and lots of choices, and finally unleashed this enormous opportunity around information, which Google and all of us are very much beneficiaries of. So open systems have this sort of very clear promise of constant innovation and even greater choice. And now we're about to go through another one, which I'm not going to spend too much time on, which is a shift to cloud computing. For those of you who have not heard the term, cloud computing is essentially where the cloud, which is the term that we use, for the network, is where all the computation is done, where all the information is. And so from your perspective, what happens is, here you are, you're here in the hall, you take out your computer, your mobile device, what have you, and everything that you care about is already on the network and brought to you in a safe and secure way. It's just a better model. And every corporation, even the people who built the last model, are all moving as quickly as they can to cloud computing. Why? Because the regulatory, the business decisions that were made in the last 10 to 20 years have enabled us to build that infrastructure, to get that information to you quickly over typically wireless communications and open standards. It seems to me that this massive shift to cloud computing has a number of other implications. So for example, if you're a small business, you can now compete fairly against the big businesses. You know, the old saying on the internet is that on the internet, no one knows you're a dog, right? And then there's a cartoon of the dog typing, right? Remember that from way back. The important point here is that on the internet, you really can compete fairly. And in a cloud computing model, it doesn't matter how big you are, it really matters the service that you offer. Another example of this innovative open model that I'm talking about. When you combine that, you also have to focus on R&D. And the situation in R&D in the last few years has not been good. It seems obvious, but let me state it. Why do we fund R&D? Because no one else does. It's actually pretty simple. Businesses, by law, have to serve their shareholders. They're not going to fundamentally invest at the level of pure research. It makes no sense for them. And even enlightened businesses ultimately are judged by their shareholders, by their rate of return, by their capital requirements. It takes government policy to take advantage of it. When I was in graduate school, I was on a fellowship from the government. It made a difference. Much of the work that I participated in the 1970s came out of some of the DARPA and NSF works. I know how real and fundamental this is. If you take a look at most of the interesting innovations have occurred not in large corporate labs, as much as I'd like to claim to you otherwise, but typically in universities where the funding has come from the NIH, the NSF, and other groups. That model works. It's a core aspect of America's competitiveness. I would argue it is the core aspect of America's core evidence. And in fact, in looking at it, the budget for basic scientific research went down last year as if we don't care. Now, do you think all interesting science problems have been solved? I can make a long list that haven't. Or how are we doing against our target of solving, cancer, atomic issues, mysteries of the universe, transportation issues, energy efficiency, and so forth? Have all they been solved? Of course not. And furthermore, you have an even greater opportunity before you. Thank goodness President-elect Obama announced as part of his platform his proposal to double the basic funding. Long, long overdue. Now, so what would you do with this money? Well, why don't we invest in science and math? Why don't we focus on it in an education context as well? We're also falling behind, as you know, against some other countries, in particular Asian countries, in this regard. Do you think that that matters? Do you think that it matters that eventually not only do the Asian economies have lots of smart people, more cash than we do because of the way they run their industries, but also a whole bunch more technical people? Do you think ultimately you'll be dealing with innovations that they come up with that drive their economies where you'll simply be the captive consumer? Well, I hope that's not the only outcome of their global competitiveness. I welcome what they're doing, but it seems to me we should get our act together right now. I mean, here's another example. We just use incentives, right? Math and science undergraduates to pursue graduate studies. And I'll come back to the fact that we then kick them out of the country if they don't have the right visa, which is another disaster. The federal tax R&D credit has been extended 11 times since 1981. We just extended it for a few more years. Just make it permanent, guys. It's like, what do we have to do here? If you do, here's another example. We train these people. We bring them to the country, right? We have the best university system in the world, bar none, and then we won't give them the visa to work here, where they would then pay lots of taxes. Okay, help me with this reasoning. Okay, I just don't understand. I have yet to find anyone who can explain to me in a rational way why we would not want the best and the brightest to come to America to create industries, invent new things, solve the various technical and operational problems we have, cure cancer, you name it. Right? Wouldn't you rather have them here? It's bizarre. It's disgusting. Sorry, I have a strong opinion. And so I'm not done. And then, of course, we have patent reform, which has got to be on the agenda because, again, innovation is part of this. And what's happening, there have been a series of very, very good patent reform bills which have not sort of made it. And the system is dysfunctional. It makes no sense. Why is every case filed in the East District of Texas? Can't come up with a legitimate answer for that. It's just bad public policy. And I'll let you check out on that one if you have an opinion. So from my perspective, patent reform litigation and then international property laws that allow internet users to access things and get the appropriate compensation are fundamental to this. Now, Google, we're doing what we can here. We believe ourselves as one of the great innovators in this space. We care a lot about it. We focus on innovation all the time. Let me give you some examples. Flu trends. We think we can sense outbreaks earlier than anyone else by looking at what people are doing in an anonymous way. It's very important. In an anonymized and aggregated way, let people know. How many lives will that save? Is it worth doing? If it's one life, absolutely. If it's a next pandemic and it's 1 million people, you betcha. So we're pretty excited about that. We'll see if that technology pursues and how far we can take that. I'll give you another example. Universal language translation. We've invented technology which uses a statistical concept which actually can translate from language to language without a dictionary, and it's bizarre. I cannot explain to you technically how it works, although people have tried, but it works. And it works enough that you can figure out roughly what they're saying. It's not as good as human translation. Why is this important? Because language causes war. right? People don't understand, they don't try to mediate, they get themselves into these hyperbolic states, bad things happen. Don't you think we'd be better off if all of those books in the Library of Alexandria had been translated into English? Don't you think that we would be better off if all of the enormously interesting works written in English have been translated into Arabic? Well, we can do that now systematically. It seems like an obvious thing, and we can now do it at scale. But we're not done. What we really want to do, and again, this is with your permission and with you signing up and with appropriate privacy, be able to answer questions that are more interesting rather than looking something up. Like, we want to be able to answer the question, what should I do this weekend? Well, the answer is, it depends. Depends on who you are, what you care about. We're not there yet, but we're working on it. We think technology can really fundamentally change the way that you think about how you spend your time, what you care about. You can be infinitely more educated. I can tell you that from Google's perspective, from my perspective as a Google user, I'm enormously more knowledgeable about the things that happen in my daily life. And it's a wonderful way of living one's life, in my view. I want to talk about energy as part of this, because we talked about technology, we talked about policy, and I want to talk about energy because we're at one of those points where we've got to get this right. And the argument roughly goes like this. Oil is infinite. Sorry, oil is finite, limited, but information is infinite. So how can you take information, how can you take the structures in the kind of stuff that I'm talking about now and apply it to something which is the lifeblood of what we do? Now these challenges are very, very hard, and they're certainly as hard as the information challenges and science challenges that I'm talking about. They may be harder because there's so many players. And we understand that energy is everything about what we do. It's interesting that it's a $1 trillion industry. $1.5 trillion US industry. It's a very, very large industry. And you have a situation where you have climate change, which can be argued is the other of the two threats against essentially global disaster, the first being nuclear proliferation. Climate change is very real. It's very much a threat in our lifetimes. You have all of the issues of the energy industry, energy efficiency, waste, and so forth and so on. And you have issues that are going on now with respect to pricing stability, incentives, and so forth and so on. Is there a way of solving this problem? So earlier this summer, a number of people got together at Google, and we said, well, is there a silver bullet? And of course, the rule is there are no silver bullets in life. Okay, but is there one? Is it possible to come up with a solution, it's a question, that solves the climate change problem, causes oil prices to go down, gets people to go to work, replaces our energy infrastructure with basically fossil fuels, creates an export industry, and, by the way, we can afford. By the way, if you ask the average person anywhere in the United States, probably certainly here in Washington, certainly in meetings I've been in, the answer is no. Okay. Well, we've produced such a plan, and it's called the Google 2030 Energy Plan. And it goes roughly like this. When you look at the energy problem, you can divide it into two halves. The first half has to do with electrical power generation, energy generation, which is primarily coal. Coal is very bad for CO2, but very cheap, very prevalent here and in China, and also natural gas. And the other half has to do with transportation. Most of the issues with oil are really transportation issues. And for various reasons, you don't use coal in your cars, and you don't use gas, you don't use oil to generate electric power. So divide the two. How do we address the fundamental issue of electricity? Well, we have a lot of ideas, but the most important thing to do in our modeling is to make sure that we have the same level of efficiency, that is consumption per citizen, now for the next 20 years. And you go, well, that's kind of wimpy. Well, an interesting fact is that the per capita energy consumption has gone up by around 50% per citizen, which means it's going even faster because the number of people in the U.S. is growing, except in states where the regulatory environment has decoupled utility profits to utility efficiency. So in California, we started this in 1973 in an act of enormous insight, I think, They change the way they regulate the industry. So they get paid based on the energy that they save, not that the revenue that they make. Interesting. 2/3 of states now in America have some variant of that, either in place or in legislation that's being discussed. So this is a very real thing. So if you make that assumption and you assume roughly $3 a gallon gas, you get energy efficiency, literally savings from plants that you don't have to build. So then you can build different kinds of plants. The observation about plants, by the way, is that plants, every plant we have now will have been rebuilt in some form by 2050. So you're going to have to rebuild them anyway. So why don't you build them differently? Stop building the coal plants and focus on solar, wind, and enhanced geothermal. Solar, right? Sun's going to shine for the rest of our lives, thank goodness. The amount of information, or the amount of power that comes from the sun, especially in the United States, of course, with our deserts and so forth, is enormously powerful. There are new technologies, these amazing solar concentrators that take all that stuff and really, really get it to wherever it needs to go. Wind is almost approaching now with these huge turbines that move very slowly, so the turbines don't hurt the birds. The cost per kilowatt hour is very close to approaching the cost of coal. So, by the way, there's a problem with solar and wind, which is there's no grid where the wind and the solar is. The people are in the cities. So the simplest thing that we have to do is we have to address the grid problem. This is independent of the smart grid. You just have to get the grid there. So in talking to the utility people, they're actually happy to build the grids, but it takes them 15 years because of the overlapping issues of government and so forth and so on. There's something called the High Plains Express. There's a wind tunnel, essentially, that goes through Wyoming, Colorado, New Mexico, and so forth that they're trying to, they can't get the infrastructure approved. So here's an example where good public policy, federal preemption, all those kinds of things, and incentives between these different players could really make a difference. So that's how energy plays out. So I'll take you through some of the ideas in more specific in a sec. There's the other half, which is cars. And you've got to do both, by the way. So what's the story with cars? Well, you know, we have these CAFE standards, the automobile industry is in trouble, and so forth and so on. Is there a solution? It looks like there is. It's called plug-in hybrids. And what happens is you have a battery. The new batteries are phenomenal and getting better, and there's a lot of battery research these days, with a small engine. The battery is charged up for 40 miles or so. This is the Chevy Volt, for example, which is going to be a great product. And you drive around for your short trips just on the battery, which you can charge from your house. But if you need more oomph to get wherever you're going, the gasoline engine then charges the battery and off you go. When you do the math of those kinds of approaches, you save half the fuel. All of a sudden, your mileage in a Prius, for example, goes from 50 miles per gallon to 100. Okay, pretty neat. Does that work for all cars? Absolutely. And there are many, many other ideas. One person, Amory Lovins, has actually done a calculation where you can improve if you do things involving flexible fuels, the use of this hybrid approach, new carbon fiber technology to make the cars lighter and stronger, and other aerodynamic styles. He can get the efficiency down by a factor of 30. That is 30. Think about what that does to our friendly oil-producing states and their ability to set oil prices and have us go through the kind of teeter-totter that we just went through in the last 6 months. Why don't we figure out a way to never let that happen? And the way to do it is to create other choices and let the market sort that out. So how does the government do this? Well, the first thing is, let's not just have bailout programs. So here's an example. Current government discussion about stimulus. And by the way, let's assume we're in a pretty severe recession. I don't actually understand how they make these decisions, but everyone assumes that we're either in a recession or entering it, and that as a result, the government will properly do a stimulus program. Why don't we use the stimulus money to get this initiative started? Why don't we get a twofer, right? Let's get the stimulation, but let's also get the infrastructure. Remember, I love infrastructure. Let's get it built. Okay? So all of a sudden, instead of just a handout program or just a subsidy, let's get it done based on the principles of the kinds of things that I'm talking about. So if you do everything with private money at risk too, so you have, matching programs and so forth, and there are smart people here in the room who understand how to design these things so the incentives are in alignment, maybe we could decarbonize our economy. Maybe we could actually get started on a multi-year maybe multi-decade program, which will ultimately produce the outcome. So for example, if you want to do stimulus, where do you do it? Give matching funds to energy utilities at the federal level, so these are state utilities, for energy efficiency programs, which they already run. They already have the legislation, they already have the standards, they already have the customers, they already have the people who talk to them. It's a no-brainer. What's interesting about those energy efficiency programs is how do they do them? They hire local contractors. What's happening in the housing industry right now? The contractors have no work. A byproduct of this is a good employment program with a wonderful impact on energy efficiency. It's literally a jobs program for people who are really desperate right now. You know, they went through the huge bubble, they all got laid off, their employment benefits are running out. Let's do it this way. Let's get them employed fixing something. There are many examples of this, insulation and so forth. And by the way, insulation, you install the insulation in your house, it pays back next year, the following year, the following year, the following year, the following year, and 50 years from now. Because oil prices are not going down. Another example. People are unwilling to do improvements to their homes because they think they're going to sell their house in 3 to 5 years, which, as we know, is not true today. Okay, but nevertheless, this is what they think. So a county in California figured out a particular kind of bond where you could take a loan to do home improvement with, green improvement for your home, and the loan goes onto your mortgage, onto your title, excuse me. So when you sell the house, that indebtedness continues at this very nice and friendly rate. And all of a sudden, people now have an incentive to think about a 7-year payback or a 10-year payback. And by the way, we all know they're going to be in their houses for 7 years anyway. But the point is, and so the city will in fact get its money back, but it's a huge societal good. You could imagine more interesting things. You could fund the auto companies, going back to the auto example, you could fund the automobile with bonuses when they beat the CAFE standards. They're clearly going to need some kind of support here. Or you could have differential tax treatment for efficient cars versus non-expensive cars, which is in fact what was done in Israel. My point here is that these ideas have been around for a while. We talk about the smart grid, matching the smart grid, federal preemption to try to get the infrastructure built fairly quickly. Here's another example, renewable portfolio standards. About 10 states have renewable portfolio standards where they've committed to get their energy portfolio. Typical example would be 10% of their energy is renewable by 2015. You could have a federal renewable portfolio standard, which has been discussed, or you could have incentives. For example, the government will help fund a transmission line between any two states as long as they have a renewable portfolio standard. These are some interesting ideas. Another thing you have to do is you have to get money going. You have to get money going into the right places. Tax credits we talked about before, solar, wind, and geothermal. How much tax credit should they get to offset the tax credits that the fossil fuel industries have absorbed over the last 50 years? If you do the math, you'll discover any number I give you is low. Right. Our calculation on the order of 10 billion would be just fine. Thank you very much. Another problem is getting money going into the system. Money is dried up. We all know this. It's very difficult to get a loan. There are ideas floating around. The most clever one that I've heard is to create a federal energy lending authority modeled on the Farm Credit Act of 1916. In this idea, you create a federally funded, that is, capitalized bank, which under a set of assumptions that need to be worked out, makes low interest, long-term loans to people to do the kinds of things and build the kind of businesses that I'm describing. And you do it with matching money and private sector and all that kind of stuff. Another example is that you can do that and you can tie that to an energy buying authority. How much oil, how much energy do you think the federal government buys every year? Okay. One number I came across was $40 billion. I have no idea if that's correct or not, but my point is these numbers are large. So you create a market, you create a lending opportunity, and you stoke the innovation. Put it all together, you have an opportunity to really go. There are even crazier ideas. There's a CO2 eating rock that if you take the CO2 and you pump it on the rock, it turns to marble. Let's find more of that rock. Solve that problem. Another person said the problem with the auto industry is the auto industry, they have 17 million capacity, they're selling 10 million, they don't have enough demand problem. One way to have demand is to reduce the number of cars people currently have by buying the polluting cars. Get them off the road creates demand. Interesting ideas. I don't know if they pencil out, but these are the ideas that need to become part of our public policy. If you put all these together, the estimates are that these are jobs programs. And we understand in a political context here in Washington that jobs programs matter. They matter a lot to our Congress, and they matter to our citizens. Estimates are that these are 1 million, 2 million, even 5 million jobs being created by these kinds of programs. We need to do these, and we need to do these now. Putting all of that together, it's time to restore trust in how our government works, how it makes its decision. So I want to return to the model of the internet and how people can use it to make decisions. Everyone here knows that the internet is changing our nation. I would argue that the internet was a big winner in 2008. There's no question that President-elect Obama used the internet very skillfully, especially early on when he was not as well known. He used the internet for fundraising, for getting his messages out, and for communicating. Over the weekend, he used, as part of his radio address, he used YouTube to communicate a video image of him giving that, which is very, very successful. What has not been as noticed is that as a result of that, people are now debating it. It's causing engagement, because on YouTube, you can not only just see his talk, but you can say whether you agree or disagree. You can produce videos that say, he's wrong, or I don't like it, or what have you. This notion of engagement is fundamental to, I think, how we get through this. Historically, how is legislation done? You have smart young staffers who sit there, you have all the politics among all of this, it's done in the corners and so forth, and then all of a sudden they unveil the legislation. Well, instead, why don't we move to much more of a consensus building model, which is what the internet allows. Why don't we get people more engaged? And yeah, you'll get your 1% crazies, right? But the fact of the matter is a lot of people want to participate. And what's interesting about it is that I'll give you the negative example first. Why did we not have more of the sort of tremendous scandals in the last year? These sort of, the political scandals where there was this issue and that issue, because many of them were based on falsehoods. And those scandals didn't occur because when a falsehood was asserted by somebody, it was corrected quickly by what I'm going to call the police of the internet. People care so passionately about these things, and they obviously have a lot of free time, right? That they tracked each and everything that everybody said. So if you're a political leader and you make a statement that's not true, you're going to hear. And especially if you say something which is at odds with what you said the hour before, because people are watching. That level of engagement is a permanent change in our political thing. And even if you don't really care about the internet and you think that we're all crazy and all that kind of stuff, as a political leader, you know this matters because you've seen your fellow members be caught in it, caught in the business as usual model when this new model is happening. So how can we take that? How can we take that forward? We have this enormous accomplishment. First African-American president in history, 40 years after Martin Luther King's assassination. It's an amazing achievement for America. We should all, whether you support President Obama or not, you should be proud of that. How can we go forward with this idea? Well, it seems to me that you want to encourage debate. More debate, more voices lets the truth emerge. And basic information that the government uses is not available. You still can't fundamentally see the information sources that are used. There have been a series of acts which have tried to open this up. The vast majority of information is still not searchable or findable, either because it's not published or because it's on websites which the government has put up, which no one can index, which is our job. These are easily solved by legislation and by a focus on getting the information out, that it's better to have all those people with you than to shut them out. And the people who have lost in the last some number of elections and political leaders have learned this. You embrace them, you don't shut them out. So how do you embrace them? Well, for example, we can stream almost all the public meetings on technologies like YouTube, YouTube's competitors, and so forth. The bandwidth is there. We built all of this. So why don't we get people more involved? Warren Buffett writes in his manual, our guideline is to tell you the business facts that we would want to know if our positions were reversed. We owe you no less. Why is that not also true of our government? Government has not embraced, generically, the tools that we all use every day. They've not embraced blogs, video, all the information sources. It's time, right? It's time to do it and to do it right. And other countries are doing this better. Britain, for example, there are examples. I was looking for examples here in the U.S. Arizona has a particularly good one where real estate agents can actually now figure out what everybody's doing, what the rules are, and so forth. There are examples, but it's nowhere where it needs to be, and there's no particular reason why it can't be done very, very quickly. So waiting to the 11th hour to solicit for input on the bills, it's crazy. Why don't you start? You'll get a better bill, and you'll certainly get more buy-in if you get earlier. And yet, culturally, we don't want to do that. Here's another example, the Patent and Trademark Office, which is as overloaded as it's ever been. They're running a very interesting new experiment where they publish the patents early for public comment. And guess what? All the players who care deeply about this bizarre and nerdy patent, really go after it. Because there's no way where their patent examiners can fundamentally get all the insight that the wisdom of crowds can do. Why is that not true of every branch of government? It makes perfect sense. Use all those people who care so passionately and who have a lot of free time to help you. So I want to finish by saying that, and put this in the context, I am very much an optimist about this. You sit there and you read the paper and you go, God, should I wake up in the morning or I should just take the day off? You feel like turning it off while it's all happening. And I don't know if we're at the low yet or if there's more lows coming, and I certainly don't think anybody else does. But I do know that the country has faced many, many more significant challenges. Let's start with World War I, World War II, you name it. And let's take the crisis, let's take this huge set of issues that we face, and let's deal with it as an opportunity to get the structure right. And the aspects of this have to do with communication, policy, and the proper regulation. That this financial crisis that we're facing today, to some degree, will force all these people who've been having such a good time arguing about tax policy in 2011, right? Something which is not particularly relevant today, right? To force them to deal with the reality of the choices they face, because the choices are not easy. They're very, very hard and very, very subtle. And figure out a way to get the population involved in those in a way that's much more immersive. That there's a recognition among Americans that you have to have private sector and public sector involvement together. That there is not a silver bullet of just government or just private freedom to do whatever you want to, regardless of its costs. So this framework gave rise to the internet. Remember, the government funded it. The government helped in its creation. It was designed by scientists. It created a business opportunity that was open, because that's how scientists think. The openness created business opportunities that created huge corporations that changed telecommunications, changed modern life, and have brought us, I think, to a much better understanding of each other. So to me, my optimism comes from sort of a rock-solid view that the genius of the American people and the power of technology, this is how I live my life every day. And that I'm convinced that armed with the internet and its sister technologies, that we can get our country back to work, that we can get really outstanding solutions over the long term, and that we can face these challenges and we can face them head on. Let me close with a quote. There's a Mr. de Tocqueville said, I'll paraphrase as a French writer, that America will do well because of the optimism of its people, its abundance of land, and its absence of a king in 1831. Okay? So let's listen to that. The optimism of its people, that's what I'm talking about now. The abundance of its land. Think about all that solar, all that wind, all those people, all those cities expanding, all that growth that is within us, and its absence of a king. Think about the peaceful transition of power to a new government, one with a new set of opportunities to succeed, and we hope them very well. So thank you very much. Go ahead. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is David Foster. I'm with the Social Security Administration.
Yes, hi.
Pleasure. Very much enjoyed your talk. We have one of the largest IT centers in the world. We're also leaders in health IT, and we pump out $1 billion a day to the American people. In many ways, we're the face of government. We are very interested in terms of what you were talking about in terms of changing the structure and getting it right. We have an IT advisory panel. We were wondering any help you could get us in terms of getting these new innovations into government would be extremely helpful for us.
It's interesting that Social Security, I think, is probably the most successful large IT project in the United States. For about 20 years, as best I can tell, the IT department has been, as far as I know, it's the largest operational such site, and it does it with enormous accuracy. So I don't know how you all do it, but it's sort of the interesting case.
Well, I also like to add that we are actually the lowest fund IT agency of comparable size.
so now we understand how to do it. But maybe because it's done so professionally, maybe it's its mission. To me, the Social Security thing is a good example where you can build a government system that is federally funded, that really does provide things which are highly, highly measurable. What I would suggest is that the opportunity with all of that data is to make as much of it available, again, in generic forms, for people to analyze, to understand, and to open up some of the information that you have to get others to be able to help you. I think the only suggestion I would make for the Social Security Administration, because I think you really are the best of the best, is how can you get the other people to help you do an even better job? And that I don't know, but I would encourage you to think about it.
Any of your colleagues, that would be terrific.
Okay, will do. Okay, thank you. They're here. Thank you very much.
I'm John Simpson. I'm with Consumer Watchdog. I was fascinated by your quote of our success coming from the fact that we don't have a king in this country.
Sure.
And I guess I would fear that perhaps you have become the king of the internet, and that has all sorts of terrible implications for privacy. And we're very concerned about the way many people enter into Google's web without even realizing that they're having information go in. We've posted 2 videos about that, which are available on our site, consumerwatchdog.org/Google, strangely enough. And we encourage everyone to look at that, but specifically for you, sir, we wonder why you haven't responded to us in over a month about these. These are very well-documented situations, how you essentially look at people's email, even if they haven't opted in, how you are now marketing all of your apps to Congress without really talking about the kind of necessary security that's there with cloud computing, which, we have issues with the privacy things. What you're doing with Congress could potentially, it seems to us, be a breach of security. So we're very eager in working with you. We think that much of what you do is fantastic, but it has to be done in a transparent way. And people, as you said, they have to opt in. Most of your material now, I would suggest, the default does this to you, and there is no easy, simple way, for instance, to opt out of auto-suggest. We have some specific suggestions. We look forward to sitting down and talking with you, and I ask you today, when can we do that?
This is not the best time to set up a meeting with me, but we can talk about it afterwards.
We can talk about it after.
Yes,
it's not easy for me to do this in front of 200 people, nor the preferred method.
So I have actually read your letter very carefully.
Thank you.
I'm generally sympathetic. You make a set of specific suggestions which have to do with SSL, HTTPS, and so forth and so on. Our general approach would be to do all of those, except that they make things slower. So, for example, in most cases, the specifics that you talk about, we have the opportunity, but the default is not to use the most secure form because it slows everything down.
But it also advantages your marketing efforts. So let's have a transparent conversation.
Again, I can assert to you, as a matter of fact, that that's not something we think about. What we do think about is latency, and literally speed. So we're looking at the specific ideas that you talked about, but ultimately we're not, I think, going to do anything that disadvantages speed. What we will do is do things which advantage communication. So I applaud your publishing, your analysis, your area of concerns, and so forth. But we're very, very focused on this from the standpoint of both the combination of performance and privacy. Some of the other specific things that you talked about, for example, you talk about email and sender versus receiver. I'm going to have to take those as product suggestions, and/or that's not how our systems work. But we can do that offline.
Oh, I would look forward to doing that offline. Thank you very much.
Yes, ma'am.
Dr. Schmidt,
Yeah.
esteemed members of the media, honored colleagues and guests. My name is Elizabeth Holford. I'm with NeutralNet. and I'd like to shift the conversation back to infrastructure. Distributed energy, as well as smart grid applications like automatic outage notification, truly advanced meter reading, those types of services require a robust 21st century two-way communications fabric in the electric utility industry. And at the same time, things like cloud computing, as well as telemedicine, telework, things that we talk about reaching into rural communities and really allowing people to function at very much higher levels than they have in the past, requires, again, a robust two-way communications fabric. The company that I'm involved in does that. One asset addressing both of these aging infrastructures. And I want to go back to the infrastructure issue because you talked about encouraging and restoring confidence in the government. What are your suggestions as somebody, as a chief development officer and as somebody who is getting a lot of feedback from the markets right now? How do we restore market confidence in investing in infrastructure and investing in innovation? Because right now, all of us realize there is money out there, and where the investments are going are into distressed assets that already exist, and our people plan to turn those around in 2 to 3 years, but it is not an investment in infrastructure or innovation. And it's an issue for us right now. How do we restore that kind of market confidence?
Well, I think partly we have the correct president to do this in the sense that President-elect Obama has indicated his support for the notion of a smart grid. There are, in fact, task forces being assembled that are looking at this question and are thinking about it in the context of short-term spending versus long-term. One of the problems that we have is that we can't do, infrastructure spending doesn't generate enough stimulation. That in my conversations I'll say, well, you know, have we spent a billion here or that, and they're talking about much larger numbers in order to get the country moving again. So I think our problem fundamentally is that we're not a big enough target, right? That the technologies are not mature enough, they haven't scaled enough yet. There's still more technical work, for example, to be done in smart grid. So my message has been more R&D funding in it. Google did a big partnership with General Electric on precisely this issue to try to get more momentum, and it sounds like your company is pushing very hard on that as well. But I think ultimately we have to create a bigger target to get the stimulus to actually include it, and that's, I think, part of our joint goal.
Thank you.
Okay, I missed somebody in the back. Yes, sir.
Yeah, hello. My name is Will Trumbull, and my question goes to utilizing bridge technologies to the point at which then we can assume using plug-in hybrid vehicles and the electrical grid that we are hopefully going to generate through the wind turbines and solar technology in the future. You know, the immediate threat of which we hear come out of folks' mouths day in and day out is that we are transferring wealth to parts of the world in forms of oil revenues, and rather than shipping our wealth abroad, keeping it here. What is your standpoint and view on utilizing natural gas as a technology, as a bridge technology, until we can create the infrastructure to live off of renewables?
Natural gas has been called the crack cocaine of the energy industry because it's extremely attractive, right? It's an easy conversion for traditional operators. Its CO2 emission is half that of, for example, coal. So you would clearly prefer that over coal in the current pricing regime. But there are many problems with LNG, and the sort of the infrastructure that makes it, the number of players, the number of sources, the global supply. So what will happen, of course, is as we move more and more to that, prices will go up, right? Which neutralizes some of its cost advantage, which is why it's so attractive. So I would prefer to have us focus on decarbonizing the economy with an understanding that if we do use LNG and CNG, we do that in specific areas. The most obvious is in fleet transportation for trucks and buses, where you have a single source of filling up. It's a local market. It's highly efficient for that use. It replaces an oil source, which is worse for the environment, et cetera. I don't think that if you scale the model of the amount of power that we need, I don't think LNG and CNG fundamentally make up enough of a gap to be the solution, and they bring with it still a significant carbon footprint.
Thanks.
Go ahead.
Hi, my name is Robert Damashek from the Binary Group. I'm a strategic advisor to the DoD and Army CIOs. We've been doing work, inside of government. You mentioned the inside and the outside connecting on trying to leverage the Web 3.0, Web 2.0 technologies to connect people together to increase transparency and all. But it's hard to know, how do we connect with the transition team? How do we connect with the folks to share our lessons learned? I can give you a white paper. What do we need to do in order to help make the inside of the government work more effectively with the outside of the government?
I don't know exactly. Since I'm not speaking for them, I want to let the transition speak on how to best communicate. I will tell you that in my contact with these people, they're very smart. They really are listening. They really are looking for new ideas. And they really are in a hurry, right, because of the issues. So I think this is a good time to be getting those ideas out there, and I know that they would welcome yours. Yeah, down here, yes. Did I miss? Oh, I'm sorry. I apologize. Way up there.
My name is Vicky Sachs. I'm from MIT. I did my PhD in management, and I met director from NSF, and I was speaking to him regarding MIT lab produces like a lot of interesting projects, and I'm curious, do you guys offer support for projects like those? For example, I did a project with a friend of mine developing telemedicine.
Sure.
He developed a polymer, and if a patient is traveling abroad or something, the polymer allows the doctor, millions of miles away to transfer the medication to terminally ill patients and things like that. So
we've been doing funding in two areas. In basic computer science, we'll work with innovators in computer science, faculty at the leading universities, including MIT. We've also been funding in energy, and we've made small technology grants to do precisely the kinds of things you're describing with respect to alternative fuels.
Sure.
We've also been investing in companies that we think are particularly promising for the energy future. So that's an example. We've not been investing so much in the healthcare because we don't understand it as well as we should.
Sure.
Yes, sir. I'm sorry.
Yes, I'm Charlie Clark, an editor with Tax Notes. I was interested in your plea to make the R&D tax credit permanent, and I was just wondering if you could speculate on any specific projects that either Google or some other major corporations would be ready to roll out if the R&D tax credit were made more reliably permanent.
Well, as you know, it was just extended for some years. So my argument was more of a long term. I mean, certainly in the short term, we're going to take advantage of the R&D tax credit that's already in place, and it does for us make a difference because so much of our expenses are tied up in our innovation. But I can't give you a specific because it was just extended, as you know. Looks like we only have time for a couple more. Okay, so who did we not call? Down here, we'll go to.
Hi. Thank you for coming today. Bill Tucker is my name. I'm a consultant, and if you mentioned it, I missed it. How do you think nuclear power would figure into providing power? It's one of the most efficient means we have, and is non-polluting.
Nuclear power is a sort of rat's nest, right, of issues. The first set of issues have to do with safety and long-term storage and the ability to do reprocessing. And those are largely, I think, political issues, not so much. There are technology issues, but they're fundamentally political issues that we face. There's a debate as to whether there should be a federal national reprocessing center that's not been resolved. I don't have a strong opinion on that, but I think those issues weigh on the industry as a whole. The second problem is an economic one. Not only have there not been any new plants in the United States since the 1970s commissioned, but the cost estimates for the plants that would be built now exceed the capital capability, literally the ability to fund those plants by the utilities. And so nuclear power in the United States will not happen, in my view, until you solve both problems. The second, there's a proposal, a working group, for example, at one of the national academies said, There are roughly 4 or 5 different interesting new nuclear power plant designs that can never get funding because the number of billions that's required to do speculative funding will never happen. So we as a country need to make a decision as to whether we want to take that expense. And it's not for me to say, but I think it's easy to say you're pro-nuke or you're against nuke. When you compare nuclear power, for example, to wind, you would build more wind farms and connect them to the existing grid quicker than you would build a nuclear power plant. Obviously, you might want to have nuclear as well, but prioritization is such that nuclear does not come first. The model that I talked about in my talk does not include any nuclear. It does not include the shutdown of any nuclear either. Nuclear, if it works, just like carbon capture and sequestration, if it works, is a net positive to the model I'm talking about. But we can achieve our energy independence without resolving the nuclear fight and without resolving the carbon fight if we focus on these other renewables. And that's what I think was so interesting about the idea.
Thank you.
Steve, it sounds like we have to go. So I apologize for those of you who had questions. Thank you very, very much.
On behalf of New America, thank you all for coming out this afternoon, and we'll see you next time.